Hello guys, on these videos we're going to go into period 2. Period 2 is 1607 to 1754, and the first thing that we're going to focus on will be the colonies in the South, which starts off with Jamestown, established in 1607. The objective that I want to do first of all is give some context, explain the context for European encounters in the Americas from 1491 to 1607. The thesis here is Spain's decline contributed greatly towards England's colonization efforts. However, the growing benefit to wealth from sugar plantations and rising population issues contributed to England's new pursuit of colonies in the 16th century. So one thing I want to do here is really hit home that this first part is establishing context prior to 1607. It's what was happening basically to England during the 16th century. So first and foremost, remember, Spain was a very powerful nation ever since Columbus in 1492 was able to get a foothold in the West Indies. And they moved on into Mexico and South America. So they established a huge hold on North and South America throughout the 16th century. So one thing England is going to do is this idea that they're going to liberate the world from Spain, and more specifically, the Catholic Church. If you remember world history, Henry VIII separated England from the Catholic Church, starting the Church of England. And so they are a Protestant country. So they want to liberate not only the world from the Catholic Church, but in a sense, the Pope. They feel the Pope has too much power, and they want to lessen the amount of power that the Catholic Church has. Richard Hakluyt gave 23 reasons why the colonies were necessary in the New World. This was towards the end of the 16th century, and he felt that this would make a huge blow against Spain's empire. One thing that helped to do that, though, is in 1588, the huge Spanish Armada, which is pictured here over the right shoulder of Queen Elizabeth here in this painting, was defeated, was destroyed. And they felt that this was encouragement, that this is their time to shine, that England is now on the doorstep of greatness, and they should pursue this empire. And one way to do that is to accrue colonies. But that wasn't the only reason why. You did have a huge population growth. You had 3 million in 1550 to about 4 million by 1600 in England. A part of this that exacerbated this population growth and overcrowding in areas like London was you had the enclosure movement taking place, where you didn't need as many peasants or people or that were farming at this time. So a lot of them moved to cities, and they were overcrowded, and they didn't have any jobs, and it was a problem for England at this time. The other thing that happened, remember, because Spain bringing in all this gold and bringing in all this silver, was that wages fell, but prices continue to rise. This is part of the effect of the influx of gold and silver that Spain was bringing into Europe. This affected all of Europe. So because of this, people are not making as much money, but prices are going up because there's so much gold now circulating in the English economy. Speaking of economy, the other thing that happened was England wanted to pursue sugar plantations, especially in the West Indies. This is going to be the huge economic enticement for England at this time, is that if they can get a hold of the West Indies, specifically the Bahamas and Barbados, that they can have sugar plantations. And with sugar plantations, you're going to have a huge amount of wealth devoted to trade with sugar. So now that we established context prior to 1607 of what's happened in England, let's get into the foundation of the colonies. First, an idea of the objective. So explain how and why in various European colonies developed and expanded from 1607 to 1754. Explain how and why interactions between various European nations and American Indians change over time. The argument that I'm going to make to help elaborate and explain these objectives are Jamestown in 1607 was founded initially for seeking profit on gold and silver, but we quickly transitioned to an economy based on tobacco cultivation. However, the interaction between colonists and the indigenous population would quickly degrade, foreshadowing similar situations in other English colonies. So this is the beginning of 1607. This is Jamestown represents the first permanent English colony here in North America. However, over the course of the next few videos, we're going to go into other colonies that are establishing at around the same time, a little bit after 1607. But our focus today is in the South, along the Chesapeake here in North America. So in North America, we tend to look at three different regions of the colonies. First, the southern colonies, starting with Virginia and Jamestown. Then we'll go into New England later on in the north, and the middle colonies, like places like Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, we'll go into later on. Like I said, our first step is to go into the southern colonies and focus here on Virginia and Maryland. And our first step is Jamestown. So Jamestown in 1607, you have to understand that Jamestown was originally founded next to a swamp. It had a huge death rate, a very high death rate because of diseases associated with living next to the swamp. And when these guys first came about in Jamestown, they were looking for gold and silver. The other problem that they were doing, or what they were causing, is they were actually dumping their garbage into the river, which caused dysentery and typhoid fever. So the environmental problems here, both by choice of moving next to a swamp, but also their own effect on the environment, caused a huge death rate for Jamestown. 109 original colonists were there in 1607. By 1608, this was cut in half. In 1609, you actually had more colonists show up. So you had 400 colonists, but by 1610, that number would be cut down to just 65. This would be known as the starving time, the winter between 1609 and 1610. And by 1616, you had 80% of the immigrants dead. So Jamestown had a very high death toll, and this will have implications later on in terms of women, in terms of what people want, in terms of land. But originally, when these colonists first showed up, the first few colonists were looking for gold and silver. They imagined, if you will, that they would come across another Tenochtitlan like the Spanish did with the Aztecs, and they felt like they were just going to come across this land, there'd be gold and silver, and they would come back to England with all this wealth. So a lot of these guys that came were of the upper class. They weren't used to working with their hands. And when they didn't find any of this stuff, they didn't know what to do. And none of them really wanted to work. They were gentlemen. Gentlemen didn't work with their hands. Enter John Smith. And John Smith, when he entered Jamestown, changed everything. He envisioned strict military control, and he famously said, "He that will not work shall not eat," whipping these people into shape. The thing that's going to replace gold and silver, though, is going to be tobacco. The Jamestown's going to transition into a colony based on a cash crop of tobacco. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But ideally, the Virginia Company, the joint stock company that established this area, wanted to find something marketable, and tobacco would be that marketable thing. But let's transition now into the relationship between Europeans, the English in this case, and the Native Americans of the region. You have the famous tale of Pocahontas and Powhatan, her father. And for the most part, the first 2 years of Jamestown were peaceful. Early colonists realized the importance of trade with Native Americans, especially since they were dying so much. Native Americans were their life source for trade, for food, so they really depend on these Native Americans. You also have the effect of the Black Legend. Remember, the Black Legend traveled throughout Europe depicting the Spanish as horrible Native Americans and how they were treated, and the English are living in the effect of that. So when they came here initially, they said, let's treat the Native Americans better than the Spanish. That's kind of the effect of the Black Legend. So for the first 2 years, they felt that they had a good relationship with Native Americans. And Native Americans, for the most part, were also felt cordial in the sense that they're going to use the Europeans for their own advantage. Powhatan was a political leader and was in charge of many Native Americans in the region, different tribes, different groups, and he was in charge of them all. In fact, the whole story about Pocahontas is it might have been just a ritual that she saved John Smith from death, it was probably a ritual that, or some kind of display of power to show that I can save your life by excusing your execution. But in 1610, the discipline that John Smith had, especially in terms of relationship between the people of Jamestown Native American, went away when he left. The English began massacring villagers indiscriminately. Pocahontas was kidnapped and held hostage. And during that time that she was held as a hostage, she converted to Christianity. By 1614, they had a peace negotiation. And part of that peace negotiation was that John Rolfe would actually marry Pocahontas in 1614 as part of that peace agreement. But years later, even after the peace of 1614, the Native Americans in the region started seeing that the English were not going away, and more English were coming over. Well, again, the effect of tobacco is people needed land to grow the tobacco, and this would be the new source of wealth. We'll talk about indentured servants here in a little bit, but indentured servants were needed on these plantations to grow tobacco, so more and more people were coming over, and Native Americans were becoming worried that these people are not leaving. And they started encroaching more and more on their land and their livelihood. So Opichanagua, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, forgive me, he felt he was the brother of Powhatan, Pocahontas' uncle, and felt this was becoming a problem and that something needed to be done. So he had a surprise attack on Jamestown. It killed a quarter of their settlers at the time, which the population was 1,200, so only 900 left after this attack. The colonists soon organized, killed and destroyed destroyed villages and killed Indians. And this basically cemented the idea in the people of Jamestown that the Indians now have forfeited any claim to land. Governor Francis White at the time of the Virginia colony said, expulsion of the savages to gain the free range of the country. In other words, eliminate Native Americans so the people of Jamestown could gain use of the land. So now, after this uprising and following defeat of the Native Americans, the balance of power has shifted now to the colonists. In 1644, about 22 years later, you have another rebellion. And in this rebellion, 500 colonists are killed. And again, the colonists rise up in Jamestown and take down the Native Americans. And at this point, the Native Americans are defeated and will no longer uprise against the people of Jamestown. 2,000 Native Americans survived this defeat and were forced to sign the subordination to the people of Jamestown. Let's switch to the economy for a second. Remember, the whole reason why they needed to use this land and the whole reason why you have this expansion and more people coming over is because Jamestown is now becoming profitable throughout the 15th century, and the profit is based on tobacco. The Virginia Company needed to attract settlers. So what they did was they created this headright system in 1618. The headright system basically said for every colonist that comes over, that colonist will receive 50 acres of land. So the trick is, if I want to get more land, I need to pay myself for other people to come over, and I will receive 50 acres for every colonist that comes over. The colonists are coming over are in the form of indentured servants. We'll talk a little bit more about indentured servants later, but essentially when they come over, I'm paying for their trip over, and they have to work for me in the fields until they pay off their contract. It's very similar to slavery in the sense that I can buy and sell people and sell it to other people in terms of their contract. So one person under the headright system and indentured servants could get a lot of land. If I can get 50 acres for one person, then if I bring 4 people over, I can get 200 acres to myself. The land doesn't go to them because they're indentured servants. I paid for their voyage. So someone could get lots and lots and lots of land under this headright system. The other impact that tobacco had, this economy, this would become a very dispersed society. There wouldn't be a central towns like formed in New England later on. there wouldn't be a lot of social unity in Jamestown. You have these large acres, these large plantations that start to develop, and you wouldn't have a central sense of community that would develop in New England in the North. So it was kind of this get rich attitude in Jamestown. The more land I get, the more tobacco I can grow, and the more tobacco I can grow, the more money I can make, and the more money I can make, the more land I can get. So it was this conscious idea that, this idea I need to build this wealth upon myself and get rich doing that. So back to indentured servants. Indentured servants at this time really, if you look at the way they were treated, wouldn't be that much different than slavery. Okay. In 1619, you have the first 20 slaves enter Virginia, but most, in fact, almost all the labor was then done by indentured servants. So think about that for a second. If you look at indentured servants and slaves, they both could be whipped for being punished. They both could be punished in other ways in terms of a indentured servant could have their contract increased if they ran away. That means they would have served longer for the landowner, the person that brought them over. So a weird thing happens here in Virginia that we don't really think about in terms of American history is that white indentured servants and African slaves were equal in their servitude. There was really no distinction between race and servitude in these colonies in Virginia. The racial idea of servitude wouldn't happen until later when only slaves would exist in servitude, and there would be no such thing anymore as indentured servants serving, and the distinction would be race there. But that doesn't happen early on in Virginia. So both white indentured servants and black slaves were equal in their servitude. There was no distinction in race at this time. You did have, however, because of the high death rate, because of the diseases going on this time, is that you had a high death rate in the tobacco fields. That meant that these indentured servants oftentimes didn't even finish their contract, so the landowner would bring even more indentured servants over, and by doing so get more land, and the likelihood that a indentured servant would survive long enough to get their own land was less and less and less in these early colonies. Women were able to command more power, especially with the high death rate. With their husband leaving or the husband dying, women can control property, women can control wealth, more power than they had back home in England. Let's shift gears now to government. The one thing that we remark about Jamestown is that in 1619, you have the House of Burgesses. This idea of the House of Burgesses would be a charter of grants and liberties to the people of Virginia. It would be the first ever elected assembly in all of colonial America, both North and South America. The difference, though, is, remember, only landowners could vote. So you have all these indentured servants. None of them could vote. Only the people that could own land could vote. But here's the thing to keep in mind. More and more people are owning land in Virginia compared to back home in England. So you have now this tradition started that if I'm able to get hold of land, then I have a say in the government. Having said that, the governor could nullify any measure made by this assembly. Ironically enough, though, in that same year, in 1619, the first ever African slaves would set foot in Virginia. So 1619 represents a landmark in terms of you have this first ever colonial assembly in America. But then at the same time, you have the first African slavery within Virginia in the South. So you have the beginning of this process of people in power tied to land, but also tied to the control of human beings. And this is going to set a precedent that's going to continue throughout most of this course that we'll discuss, and the implications of African slavery here in the United States, or will later become the United States. So let's shift gears. Now that we talked about Jamestown, let's talk about the other colony that starts along the Chesapeake Bay, the colony of Maryland. Established as a proprietary colony to one individual, Ceciluis Calvert, and Calvert, he had full and free absolute power. He wanted to create almost like a feudal system. and he wanted to control trade, and he actually felt that he wanted to create this fief. But the idea behind it was that he was Catholic. You got to remember that Catholics are being persecuted back home in England. So he wanted to create this refuge for Catholics, but also this almost feudal system where he has control. The thing was that under this new charter, under this agreement, this proprietary colony, that colonists also had all the privileges, franchises, and liberties of Englishmen. So this will be a recipe for conflict later on, where he feels he wants to create this idea that he's in charge, almost like a king over his land. But as more people come into this colony, they feel they have rights as Englishmen. And keep in mind, the Catholics are going to be the minority because the majority are going to be Protestant. They're going to use indentured servants well, and almost all of these indentured servants are going to be Protestant. So you're going to have the beginnings of a problem later on, but for the most part, this is the beginning of Maryland being founded as a Catholic refuge. The other problem that they had is they did have a high death rate. Most marriages only lasted 8 years, very similar to Jamestown in the situation that people are dying. The indentured servants are dying. 70% of men died before they were 50. Half the children did not live long enough to become adults. However, unlike Jamestown, which had a problem of not really giving indentured servants land when they ended their contract, in Maryland indentured servants received a little more generous portion. When they received the end of the contract, the indentured servants received 50 acres of land. So there was a difference there in terms of how indentured servants would be treated between Jamestown and Maryland, even though they're right next to each other. So in closing, Jamestown marks the beginning of permanent English colonies in North America. It's also the beginning of elected representative government and the continued conflict with Native Americans. This is also the beginning of slavery and its ties to economic development in the country and power. In the next video, I will discuss what colonies developed in North and New England areas. Thank you for watching, and thank you for your time.